A grandmother and her little granddaughter vanished without a trace by Pine Creek, leaving a whole town searching for answers. Behind their disappearance stood a neighbor whose charm masked a temper capable of unthinkable acts. For 15 years, the truth lay buried, until one fisherman made a discovery that turned the entire case upside down. But only listen to how this long-buried secret unraveled, and why justice, at last, came roaring back to life. On a sweltering afternoon in July 2004, Marion Willows set out with her 8-year-old granddaughter Emily to spend a quiet day by the water. The sun was high, casting sharp reflections on Pine Creek as cicadas hummed in the background. For Marion, the river held memories of gentler times. She had taught her daughter Sarah to swim here long before the small town of Willow Creek began to feel like a place stuck between past and present. That day, Marion wore a simple blue dress and carried a woven picnic basket with sandwiches and lemonade. Emily, in her favorite yellow sundress and white sandals, clutched a worn-out stuffed rabbit as they walked along the dirt path. She skipped ahead at times, her laughter echoing through the trees, but never strayed far from her grandmother's side. Locals later recalled seeing them on the old wooden bridge near the bend of the river. Marion stood with her arm gently resting on Emily's shoulder as they gazed at the water below. Some said they appeared to be deep in conversation, others that they looked perfectly at peace. No one suspected this would be the last sighting of the pair. Hours passed. A passing jogger noticed the basket abandoned near the riverbank. Emily's sun hat lay in the grass, damp from morning dew. The water looked calm that day, almost deceptively so. Yet by evening, when Sarah called her mother's home and received no answer, worry settled in like a stone in her chest. She called neighbors, then the police. By nightfall, search teams were scouring the area. Flashlights danced along the river's edge. Voices shouted names into the darkness. They found footprints leading down the muddy bank and traces of flattened grass, but no signs of struggle, no clear answers. By the end of the week, divers had combed every stretch of Pine Creek. The search extended into the woods and nearby fields, but turned up nothing. As days stretched into weeks, hope began to wane. Officials concluded that Marion and Emily had likely fallen victim to the river's hidden currents. The case was closed quietly, almost as if it had never happened. But Sarah couldn't let go. She knew her mother to be cautious, especially near water, and Emily had never been the reckless type. There were too many questions left unanswered, too many details that didn't fit. And deep down, an unease lingered in the town as well. Pine Creek seemed quieter after that summer, as if holding its breath, guarding a secret only it knew. 15 years slipped by like pages in a worn-out book, yet the shadow of that summer never left Willow Creek. Locals avoided the old wooden bridge, especially in the evenings, claiming the place felt different somehow, too still, too quiet. Pine Creek, once a favorite spot for fishing and family picnics, became a place people spoke about only in hushed tones. For Sarah, the years had been heavier than most could imagine. She moved 3 towns over, started a new job, even adopted a dog to fill the emptiness of her quiet home. But no amount of distance or distractions could silence the memories. Every July brought back the same haunting questions. What happened to them? Why did they vanish without a trace? Then, in late spring of 2019, a man named Jackson Moore decided to fish at Pine Creek. Jackson was in his early 50s, a quiet man who came to the river often after work to clear his head. That evening, the sky was streaked with shades of orange and violet, and the water mirrored the colors like a sheet of glass. Birds chirped nearby, and for a moment, the scene felt almost peaceful. He cast his line as usual, letting it settle in the calm water. Minutes passed with nothing more than the gentle tug of the current. Then came a pull, sudden and strong. Jackson gripped his rod tighter, certain he had hooked something big. As he reeled it in, the line jerked violently, resisting his efforts. At first, he thought it was a log, maybe a piece of debris caught in the shallows. But when the object broke the surface, it wasn't wood. It was pale, curved, and small enough to fit in both hands. The setting sun caught on something metallic embedded within it, a faint glint of gold. Jackson froze. His pulse quickened as realization dawned. He reached for his phone with trembling fingers and called the sheriff's office. Within hours, Pine Creek was swarming with investigators, their boots pressing into the soft earth along the bank. Flashlights swept over reeds and driftwood as men in gloves carefully retrieved the object. It was confirmed the next morning, a human jawbone with 2 gold crowns still intact. Dental records left no doubt. It belonged to Marion Willows. The discovery sent ripples of shock through Willow Creek. News outlets picked up the story, their headlines reigniting long-buried fears. Cold case reopened after Fisherman's grim discovery. For Sarah, the call from the sheriff's office brought both relief and dread. Her mother had been found, but Emily was still missing. Questions that had lain dormant for over a decade surged back with new urgency. Why had only Marion's remains surfaced? And if the river had carried her away, why hadn't Emily been found too? The town whispered again, this time louder than before. Some said it was just a tragic accident, as they'd always believed. Others began to wonder if Pine Creek was keeping secrets far darker than anyone had imagined. The news of Marion's Jawbone spread quickly through Willow Creek, stirring up old memories and long-forgotten whispers. It wasn't just a discovery, it was a rupture in the quiet life of a town that had spent 15 years trying to forget. Coffee shops buzzed with hushed conversations. At the local grocery store, older residents exchanged knowing glances. Some spoke of the river like it was cursed, while others started questioning what really happened that day. As investigators reopened the case, Sarah returned to Willow Creek for the first time in years. Driving past her childhood home felt surreal. The shutters were closed, the garden overgrown. But what unsettled her most wasn't the house. It was the people. Some neighbors wouldn't meet her eyes. Others offered tight smiles that didn't reach their faces, as if they knew more than they wanted to say. Detectives combed through the original case files and noted a detail that had been overlooked back then. A witness, an elderly man named Howard Bell, had reported seeing Marion arguing with someone near the riverbank just days before the disappearance. The man she quarreled with was described as tall, broad-shouldered, with a deep voice that carried even from a distance. That description fit one person perfectly, John Hayes. John had been Marion's neighbor for nearly 20 years. On the surface, he was a respected man in the community, known for helping with repairs and volunteering at local events. But beneath that friendly exterior was a reputation for a temper that flared too easily. Police records revealed several complaints over property disputes, including more than one involving Marion. Most notable was an argument over the boundary fence between their properties. Marion had wanted to replace it after years of wear, while John insisted it was unnecessary. Their dispute escalated into shouting matches, audible even to neighbors across the street. But there was something else, something no one could explain. In the fall of 2004, just weeks after Marion and Emily vanished, John abruptly sold his home and moved out of state. No farewell, no explanation. He left behind an empty house and a trail of questions no one dared ask. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she stood in front of the house that had once been his. The windows were dark, the yard untended, and yet it felt like the walls themselves were holding on to secrets. Detectives began interviewing those who had known John. Some described him as generous and kind, but others hesitated before speaking, lowering their voices as if afraid of being overheard. One neighbor finally admitted, there was always something about him, like he carried a storm around inside. When Marion went missing, we all thought about him, but no one wanted to believe it. As investigators pieced together these fragments, the picture that emerged was troubling. What had once been dismissed as an accident now seemed laced with intent. And for the first time in years, Sarah felt the heavy weight of a possibility she had tried to push away. Maybe her mother and daughter hadn't been lost to the river's currents. Maybe they had been taken from her. The investigation had shifted from quiet interviews and dusty records to something far more visceral. It wasn't just a cold case anymore. It was alive, pulsing with urgency. Sarah felt it every time her phone buzzed with updates from the detectives. Each message pulled her deeper into a truth she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Detectives had started zeroing in on John Hayes, the man who had once lived across the street from Marion. His name kept surfacing in conversations with neighbors, like an echo bouncing back no matter how many years had passed. One woman remembered how Marion had confided in her weeks before the disappearance, saying Hayes had become increasingly aggressive during their property dispute. Another recalled seeing Hayes loading large buckets of cement into the back of his truck one evening. At the time, she thought nothing of it. Now, it seemed chilling. But the breakthrough came when the current owner of Hayes' former home contacted authorities. He explained that ever since moving in, he'd noticed something odd in the basement. A patch of concrete in one corner didn't match the rest of the floor, different texture, slightly uneven. The owner had brushed it off for years, assuming it was a quick repair done by Hayes. But with recent news about Marion's remains surfacing, he felt compelled to speak up. Forensic teams arrived early the next morning. Sarah stood outside, arms crossed against the chill of dawn, as officers in dark jackets carried equipment past her. She wanted to be inside, to see with her own eyes, but part of her was terrified of what they might find. In the basement, investigators used ground-penetrating radar to scan the floor. The screen displayed irregular patterns beneath the patch of concrete. There were voids, pockets where solid ground should have been. The team leader nodded grimly. "There's something down there," he said. The sound of sledgehammers striking concrete echoed through the house. Dust hung heavy in the air, mixing with the scent of damp earth as the first cracks split the surface. It took hours of careful work before a faint, musty odor rose from the broken floor. Then they saw it, a faded quilt wrapped tightly around a small bundle. Hands in latex gloves carefully unfolded the fabric, revealing a pair of tiny, white sneakers. The letters Emily were scrawled in faded marker across the sole. A plastic hair clip shaped like a butterfly tumbled from the folds. The room fell silent. Even the seasoned investigators paused, the weight of the discovery pressing down on everyone present. Upstairs, Sarah waited in the kitchen, her hands gripping the edge of the counter until her knuckles turned white. When the lead detective emerged, his face said everything. She didn't need to hear the words. Her knees buckled, and she sank into a chair, tears spilling unchecked as she pressed trembling hands to her mouth. Outside, news of the find spread quickly. Reporters gathered at the edge of the property, their cameras flashing like distant lightning. Neighbors who once defended Hayes now muttered apologies. Others spoke in hushed tones about his temper, the fights they overheard, and the strange timing of his sudden move out of state. Detectives dug deeper into Hayes' life after Willow Creek. Records showed he had sold his house for well below market value and vanished almost overnight. Months later, he resurfaced in Florida under a slightly different name, remarried, and slipped into the role of an unassuming retiree. He had built a new life, free from suspicion, but his past was no longer a distant shadow. It was here, at his doorstep, demanding answers. For Sarah, the grief and rage were a storm she could barely contain. She had spent 15 years imagining 1,000 scenarios, clinging to the hope that Emily was somehow alive. Now, faced with undeniable proof of her daughter's fate, she felt both shattered and resolute. She would not let Hayes escape justice. Not this time. As night fell over Willow Creek, the house stood in eerie silence once again. But it was no longer just an old property with creaking floors and fading paint. It was a crime scene, a place where secrets had been buried, secrets now clawing their way to the surface. When John Hayes opened the door to his small bungalow in Florida, the last thing he expected to see was a pair of detectives standing on his porch. The air was thick with humidity, cicadas buzzing in the distance, but in that moment, everything around him seemed to fall silent. "Mr. Hayes," one of them asked, "we need to speak with you about an investigation in Willow Creek." John froze. His eyes flicked to the badges, then to the marked car parked at the curb. For a split second, his practiced calm wavered. He had spent 15 years building a quiet life, far from the town where whispers once followed him down every street. But the past had found him. In the interrogation room hours later, John sat under harsh fluorescent lights. His hands rested on the table, fingers drumming lightly, a nervous habit he hadn't shaken even after all these years. Across from him, Detective Alvarez laid out photos: Marion's jawbone, Emily's shoes, the quilt from his basement. Each image was a dagger aimed at the thin veneer of his composure. "You know why you're here," Alvarez said evenly. "You know what we found." At first, John denied everything. His voice was calm, measured. He insisted he had nothing to do with the disappearance, claimed Marion must have lost her footing near the river, and Emily. Maybe she wandered off. Kids do that. But Alvarez and his partner didn't flinch. They pressed harder, showing him aerial photos of his old property, forensic reports, and statements from neighbors. Then came the detail that broke his mask: the butterfly hair clip. It lay on the table between them, small and innocuous. John stared at it for a long moment. His lips pressed into a thin line, and for the first time, his eyes betrayed something: fear, or perhaps regret. "She wouldn't stop screaming," he said suddenly, his voice hoarse. The confession seemed to spill out, unbidden, as if a dam had burst inside him. "I didn't mean to. It wasn't supposed to happen like that." He leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling as if searching for words that would somehow absolve him, but none came. According to John, the day Marion and Emily vanished, an argument had erupted near the riverbank. The dispute over the property line had turned heated. In a moment of rage, he shoved Marion. She stumbled, lost her balance, and fell. When Emily screamed and tried to run, panic set in. He acted on impulse, trying to silence the situation before it spiraled further. His words were flat, almost mechanical, but the weight of them filled the room like lead. Back in Willow Creek, Sarah received the call she had been waiting for and dreading for over a decade. John Hayes had confessed. The man who once lived across the street, who waved politely on summer mornings, had taken her family from her. She stood in her kitchen, clutching the phone, tears streaming down her face. There was no joy in the news, only a hollow ache where hope used to be. But there was also resolve. Her mother and daughter could finally be laid to rest, and Hayes would face justice. The trial drew national attention. Reporters lined the courthouse steps, cameras flashing, as Hayes was led inside in handcuffs. His expression was unreadable, but Sarah, sitting in the front row, refused to look away. For 15 years, she had lived in the shadow of what he had done. She would no longer give him the power to haunt her. As the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, the courtroom erupted in quiet murmurs. Sarah closed her eyes and let out a breath she felt she had been holding for years. Outside, the sun shone brightly over Willow Creek, but the old river still flowed with its same slow current, as if nothing had happened. And yet, for the first time in years, the air felt lighter. The morning of the funeral dawned gray and still. A thin mist curled along the streets of Willow Creek as church bells tolled softly in the distance. For Sarah, it felt as though time itself had slowed, giving the town a chance to hold its breath one final time. 2 caskets stood side by side in the small chapel, one for Marion, the other for Emily. Simple arrangements of white lilies adorned them, their fragrance filling the air with a bittersweet calm. On the front pew, Sarah sat clutching a folded photograph. It showed her mother and daughter laughing together in the park, unaware of how fragile those moments truly were. People came in quiet streams, neighbors, friends, and strangers who remembered the headlines from 15 years ago. Many carried flowers, others brought only tears and whispered prayers. Even the sheriff, who had worked tirelessly to reopen the case, stood silently at the back, hat in hand. As the service began, Sarah listened to the soft murmur of the pastor's voice. His words spoke of love, loss, and the endurance of memory. But Sarah's thoughts drifted. She remembered Marion's warm hands guiding hers as a child, Emily's giggles as she learned to ride her bike. These were the pieces she would carry forever, untainted by what had happened. When the caskets were lowered into the earth later that afternoon, Sarah felt both the crushing weight of finality and a surprising lightness. For years, she had lived in limbo, tormented by questions. Now, there was no more uncertainty, no more waiting by the phone for news that never came. Her family could finally rest. Willow Creek itself seemed to change in those days. The old wooden bridge was no longer avoided, but became a quiet memorial site. Someone had left a small bouquet tied to its railing, a note tucked beneath it. We remember. We forgive. We heal. As for John Hayes, his trial and sentencing had left the community divided. Some still struggled to reconcile the man they had known with the truth of his actions. But Sarah didn't dwell on him anymore. Justice had been served, and she refused to give him another thought. Weeks later, Sarah visited Pine Creek alone. The air was crisp, the water moving gently as sunlight danced across its surface. She knelt by the riverbank, trailing her fingers through the cold water. It no longer felt like the place that had stolen everything. Somehow, it felt quieter now, almost at peace. Standing, she took a deep breath. The grief would never fully leave her, she knew that. But as she looked toward the horizon, there was something else in her chest too. Not joy, not yet, but the first faint stirring of hope. And for the first time in 15 years, Sarah felt she could finally take a step forward.